So every spring I give a talk to a group of Harvard Medical School students, and who are part of my job when I give that talk is to tell these students who have been cooped up inside all day long how beautiful the weather is outside. Well, for those of you who have been attending here all day and you haven't gotten outside, you got lucky. It's nasty out there. So these are interesting times in venture capital. If you look back to 2014 and much of 2015, every aspect of venture was going well. You had, if you think about new companies being formed, follow-on financings, crossover financings, IPOs, exit, everything was working well. In fact, you really had to go back to 1999, 2000 to where you could start to see statistical comparables. Anytime you have to compare venture to 1999, you know you're in a good environment. Then a few months ago, things started to get more complicated, particularly from an IPO perspective. So I think this panel is particularly timely. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, which is financing breakthrough cancer companies. We have a fantastic group of panelists to lead us through the conversation and talk about what's going on in venture right now. And I don't need to reintroduce Meg, since most of you just saw her downstairs. Thank you very much.
Easy to.
Our mics are on.
Microphone is on.
We're loving this music. It's I kind of wanted to dance up on stage. So my name's Meg Tirrell. I'm the Biotech and Pharma reporter with CNBC, and I am just delighted to be with this awesome panel. I thought we could start, you guys probably know all of these gentlemen, but maybe if they could kind of give us a little bit of an introduction of who they are and sort of their investing philosophy. So JF, maybe we'll start with you.
Good afternoon, I'm Jean-François Formela. I'm a partner with Atlas Venture, and we invest in very early stage startups, including oncology.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Leff. I'm a partner with Deerfield Management. We are a healthcare investment firm managing about $6 billion in capital. And we have a range of different funds pursuing different strategies and companies at different stages of their life cycle. But I guess the overall theme is we're looking for things that are important and transformative in improving healthcare.
Hello, my name is Amir Nashat. I'm a partner at Polaris Partners. Similar to Atlas Venture, we invest in early stage companies, in particular biotechnology platforms in the healthcare space.
I'm Chris Viehbacher. I'm the managing partner of Gurnet Point Capital. We're a $2 billion fund with a single LP, which means we're the ultimate in long money. We invest especially in early stage clinical stage companies. We are interested in acquiring companies that are in early phase of commercialization, and we're interested in non-invasive medical technologies and digital health.
And I want to encourage everybody to submit questions here. I have this iPad, and I would love to take questions from the audience. I'd like to start by asking sort of a broad question about the environment right now for investing in biotech and cancer specifically. The public markets are certainly not feeling good about biotech. But are you guys kind of feeling that same feeling in what you're investing in? Maybe we'll start with Chris on the end.
Well, it's a good time to be buying, that's for sure. I think what's happened is, I mean, if you look at the biotech index today, it's still well above where it was in 2011. So it looks miserable when you compare it to 2015 in the last 6 months. But if you look over the last 5 years, you look over the last 10 years, biotech index has still outperformed the S&P 500 and the Dow. So it still remains fundamentally strong. What's happened is, I think, is a lot of generalist money came in sort of the 2011 to 2015 period, discovered there are a few bumps in the road in our industry, and now have disappeared. But I think the investors who have been committed to healthcare over the years are still here. A lot of them were able to raise money in 2015. I think the issue is probably more about exits rather than new investments, because there is money for new investments. I think the concern is just because of the IPO situation at the moment.
Anybody else have different thoughts on that question?
Well, sorry, I guess I would add that one of the interesting dynamics to look at as the public market got very enthusiastic about biotech for a couple of years and then has come back down in terms of the level of enthusiasm, but not nearly as far down as it was prior to the 2013 timeframe. One of the interesting dynamics to look at is where does the capital come from to finance private companies, and in particular early stage companies. The interesting phenomenon there, I think, is that what you saw in the time frame from sort of 2009 to 2012 was really a decimation of the environment, and the number of funds that were really set up to do early stage venture capital in biotech dwindled. Many of those shifted to a different focus or simply didn't raise new funds. And outside of a handful of funds really here in the Boston area, many of them represented here on this panel as it happens, but outside of a handful of funds, there really was much less capacity to do the translational kind of investing, taking things out of the academic environment and doing the heavy lifting of building companies around it. Even when the public markets came back, there was tremendous enthusiasm for those companies that were perceived as candidates to go public in the relative near term, but still a limited amount of capital available to do the really early stage translational investment in innovation. That started to change. There have been some new funds raised, including one that we raised, the Deerfield Health Innovations Fund. But I do believe that there continues to be a potential mismatch in the amount of capital that's available to do the early stage kind of investing with the scope of the opportunity set coming out of academic science.
Yeah, I mean, my take on that is I think it's probably misleading to equate the health of the sector just to the public market. I think the public market is an important source of financing, but as Chris was pointing out, it's probably more on the later stage side. What's important is the health of the early stage market, at least as we talk about innovation and creating new companies. And interestingly enough, if you look at the data, the supply of new startup over the years, whether the public market was very healthy or not, hasn't really changed that much. There aren't many early stage funds that can create companies from scratch. What's as important as the health of the public market is the health of pharma and the health of the industry and the ecosystem at large. And as many of you probably know, pharma is probably sitting today on $200 billion of capital. And if you do your job right as an early stage investor, there are plenty of opportunities to get funded and to get exit independently of the public cycles.
I want to touch on something that Jonathan said about just the opportunities being greater than what we can even fund right now. And that leads me into the next question, and maybe I'll start with Amir. What are some of the most exciting things you're seeing out there right now that either you've started companies around or you'd like to start companies around?
Sure. Well, obviously, immuno-oncology is on everybody's mind right now. As it turns out, typically with investing, the best time to invest in something is when people don't like it, especially when you do early stage. And I think there's a lot of really good ideas coming through right now. The noise, there's a lot of kind of oxygen getting pulled out of the room towards really exciting areas in immuno-oncology, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, more on the panel. But certainly gene control is an area, super enhancers and gene editing, and a whole bunch of new tools that are coming down the line to help us understand which genes we want to regulate and how to regulate them better. I think cell therapy is another area, not just with the immuno-oncology, but you have cancer vaccines and a lot of other ideas beyond just checkpoint that are coming along. And there's a whole new enthusiasm around the innate immune system and macrophages and other aspects of that people seem really excited about. It's going to take years to sort all this out with plenty of ups and downs. But within that, we're seeing a lot of reinvigoration of new ideas around oncology, whereas if you looked 5 years ago, it was basically one kinase or another kinase or a third kinase. And so I think in many ways, it's more of a renaissance in terms of people trying new things right now in oncology than ever before.
And what would you attribute that to? Big sort of breakthroughs in labs? All of the funding that's going in? I mean, what has contributed to so many different diverse opportunities?
Well, I mean, I think that what immuno-oncology has done in some sense is gotten people excited that there's hope, that you can actually crack the nut. And so a lot of people are taking out their their nutcrackers and starting to smash walnuts all around. And so I think people have hope. You saw this in multiple sclerosis as an example. The first drug wasn't the best drug, but it encouraged people to try to invent new drugs, understand the biology better, and help patients. So I think you're seeing that in oncology, where people are excited about the results, whether it's with immuno-oncology or the BRAF inhibitors, et cetera. And so then they're just plowing more and more enthusiasm into the area. So I think success begets success in some ways. That's my view.
I agree with that, and I would say that the biggest driver of the money flowing into the oncology area right now is the quality of the science, and it's the science that's been done over the period of decades that maybe some of the promise wasn't realized as quickly as many people hoped, but that body of knowledge and understanding of immunology, understanding of cancer pathways, understanding of the molecular basis of tumors and the ability to target the right patients with the right drug has really created this opportunity in oncology. And at the end of the day, what we're seeing now are better drugs than what we were seeing 5 years, 10 years ago in terms of the impact that they have on cancer therapy, the benefit that they provide, and that leads to the opportunity set being exciting from where we sit.
Before we go on, I just want to mention my iPad isn't loading questions. I don't know if somebody can come grab it and maybe help me fix that, because I'd love to take some questions from folks. In the meantime, I don't want to leave this topic yet of what's exciting right now, and just wonder if anybody else on the panel wants to share anything they're particularly excited about, whether it's immuno-oncology or something completely different. Thank you.
Chris?
Well, I mean, one of the things to remember is that there are a lot of ways that you can attack cancer. And one of the things we shouldn't forget, even going back to the first question, is, although we're really excited about what we're seeing in cancer today, we have to remember that these are things that were funded 7-8 years ago. So even if you went back and looked at where financial markets were, there was still a lot of belief in it, and it was partly because of a lot of the tools and the pathways that we're finding. Immuno-oncology right now, and if you step back and just look at research and development in general, and you did a heat map of where investment is going, by far and away the biggest area of research and development investments going into cancer. Second thing is, though, that a lot of money now is going into immuno-oncology, but we also know that so far only a certain number of cancer types can be benefiting from those treatments. What we also are seeing, though, are a lot of other areas. I happened to be at MIT just last week or the week before, where we're looking at a number of new companies in cancer prevention. We still have a big issue on, for instance, colon cancer. Not many people are getting that colonoscopy, and it's only about 19% of the people who should get one are getting one. Can you make that easier? And so there's new technologies in that. Pain is still a huge area of unmet need in cancer. People, particularly with bone metastases, suffer incredibly, and yet we haven't seen much going on there. And then there's new research going on there. The rest of the cancer market hasn't gone away either, just because there's immune therapies. But what we're also seeing is, how do you make those drugs better? So, for instance, if you take drugs that are out to kill cancer cells, can you deliver the payload more effectively? Sometimes you see nanoformulations of drugs that are meant to get to the target better. You're seeing antibody drug conjugates, bicycle drug conjugates. There are a number of different ways where we can take existing therapies and figure out how do we make them more effective or less toxic. Then there are things like nanotechnologies that are actually expanding the way you can use radiation therapy. Either it's more targeted or can potentiate radiation therapy. So there's actually quite a large spectrum of things that you can go and invest in. And in fact, from where I sit, I'm probably going to be less involved in the immuno-oncology, because the big pharmas are all there. And there's so much money going into that already. And to Amir's point, you actually want to go look at things that are kind of not flavor of the month at the moment to actually create value. But there's an awful lot in oncology just beyond immuno-oncology.
Couldn't tell if one of you guys wanted to talk.
I'll jump in briefly. I mean, first of all, our view is that we're in the middle of a perfect storm in many aspects, which is biology and all the tools that are used for drug discovery are getting better rapidly, from chemistry to biologics to RNA drugs. obviously CRISPR, gene editing, and siRNA, which are very powerful tools to interrogate biology, are essentially enabling us to learn way faster and to be able to validate novel science much more rapidly, which for early stage investors is very important because we can get that signal we're looking for, which is what is the odds that we can actually validate that science and move into translation. And today, we can do that much more rapidly than we could do that 10 years ago. So that's just a general backdrop, and that's the reason why there is a tremendous supply of science and innovation. And in some ways, we're somewhat capital constrained, particularly on the early stage, because there is a huge amount of opportunity to invest in. I think immuno-oncology is obviously very, very exciting, but I'd like to point out that it's incredibly early, and it's a very young field. I mean, right now, most people have been focusing on checkpoint in T cells, but you can look at every single immune cells, from T cell to macrophages to NK cell to potentially other type of cell in the innate immunity system, and you can start dissecting all of the different role of each of those cells in the response to different type of tumors. So, checkpoints is a great area of investment. We've done very well, but we've moved away from that already about 2 years ago, and we're focusing on the next generation of immuno-oncology approaches.
In some ways, I feel like venture capitalists are like the hipsters of the investing world. It's like they know what's cool like 2 years before it's cool. Yeah. Amir, I want to follow up on one thing you said, and then we'll move on to a different topic, mentioning that I/O is kind of sucking the air out of the room a little bit. Just maybe expound upon what that means.
Well, I think Chris, said it very elegantly, which is there's a whole existing industry that's currently treating, people who suffer from cancer or diagnosed with cancer, and then there's a whole industry to help more people, basically get screened and diagnosed early so we can have a chance at saving lives. That whole industry right now, there's tons of interesting technology. There's lots of things to improve, not just on the device side, but also on the service side, et cetera. And it seems like everybody's really focused on immuno-oncology. So it's, I think this will pass. I think people will start to become more interested in those other approaches as well, and they'll find them to be complementary. I mean, there's no question that for any cancer therapy to work properly, it needs to sit within a continuum of care and actually a continuum of therapy. So you're seeing a lot of combination work coming out now between chemotherapeutics and immuno-oncology, et cetera. So I think that there's a whole bunch of work to be done, and I think Chris laid it all out very well. We are very intrigued by the things that people are ignoring right now. To the hipster analogy, I guess we want to move into bad neighborhoods, right? Try to gentrify them. And so that's really kind of what Jean-François is doing by being a couple of moves ahead in the immuno-oncology area. It's what some of my partners do by investing in services and diagnostics companies. It's the work that Chris mentioned around lots of areas to improve existing drugs.
I want to ask you guys about pricing. How much does that influence what choices you make in terms of what you invest in, even at this very early stage? Maybe Jeff, start with you.
Well, I think it's a huge issue. I mean, fundamentally, all of us in the industry should be worried about what's going on with pricing right now. I think there is a lot of disingenuous, at best, statement being made by other part of the industry. I think no one is trying to deny the fact that there has been abuse within the pharmaceutical industry. I think we're not going to repeat what everything has already discussed about some specialty pharmacy company and so on. I think there is also some abuse within the biopharma community, but fundamentally, if you look at the quality of the intervention we deliver pound for pound, there is absolutely no question that it's a feature of healthcare. So the question for the ecosystem and for the policymaker is how do we all have a responsible approach to that system to make sure that there is an economic sustainability in the drug discovery and the drug development process. And it's clearly a big worry. There is a lot of politics as opposed to policy in that debate today. And I think we should all be hoping and pushing for policy to prevail and politics to fade out.
What do you mean by disingenuous statements? I know you were just kind of explaining what you meant there, but I was very intrigued by that word.
Well, I didn't want to go there because we're invited by MGH, and so I'm not going to mention MGH by name, but there is a very well-known...
I think you just mentioned it twice.
There is a very well-known hospital in New York where one of the well-known oncologists has been making a lot of noise about the price of oncology drug. It so turns out that we know some people in our communities that unfortunately had to be treated there, and the cost of the infusion within that institution is 5 times the cost of the drug. And they actually take that profit on their P&L. So I have a very simple question. If it's so expensive, why are you charging 5 times the price of the drug? So that's a good example. As far as the insurance company, a lot of the drugs that are being dispensed in hospital or large healthcare provider group are being bought at the rebate price, which typically can be as low as 50% of the list price, but then it's being charged to the end consumer at the list price. So there are a lot of practices that, and I think we should all resist the desire to start, putting the dirty laundry, so to speak, on the table. But I think people have to be fair. If they want one side of the industry to be transparent, then everybody should be transparent, and then we'll be better off for it. So those are examples of incomplete set of information that are leading to the bad political choices.
Make a comment on that. I think I agree with Jean-François' comments around transparency, and it's easy to point fingers at each other, but I think we need a communal solution to this problem. I think I think the idea of cost is actually kind of, to me, a facetious argument. I look at like my parents, what they spent on telephone bills, right, when I was a child, and there's just no question that I spend probably 10 times more on the phone with my family than my parents did, right? But what's called the phone, right, in my family is everything, it's a telecom. I mean, I work on it, my kids are watching TV on it. It's a whole embedded set of services. And as technology improves, we are going to pay more for it. So if you think about what we were delivering as an industry, say 20 years ago, it was a few weeks of advanced life, because that's all the technology allowed us to do. You had chemotherapeutics, you did the best you could, radiation, et cetera. And now it's possible that these drugs are going to allow people to live a lot longer, a tremendously longer life now, if they're diagnosed with cancer. That's, of course, going to cost more. There's no question about it. But it's also going to create tremendous productivity. People are going to be able to stay in jobs. They're going to be able to live longer lives. They're going to contribute to the economy, the society, et cetera. So I think this idea that, we're going to reduce costs by having better medicines is kind of true in the global scale of things. We're going to live longer, much more productive lives. We're going to make a lot more money. It's very clear economic analysis, very rigorous work has been done to show that the totality of American investment in healthcare, and this relates to cancer specifically as well, in improving people's health and longevity, has added approximately half of GDP growth over the last 30, 40 years. I mean, you could argue that one of the reasons why America continues to be the leading economy in many ways in the world is because of our investments in increasing our own longevity and reducing mortality and morbidity. In cancer, there's pretty well worked out studies that show that when you reduce mortality, how much of an increase in economic value goes for that. So, me arguing with Verizon that my phone should cost, my telecom should cost less while I've got, 4 iPads and all this stuff happening in my house, compared to my, my family phone that basically could barely dial. I could only dial local. I don't think we were even able to dial international. It's just, it's a silly argument. And so I think we have to understand the total value of what we're providing, and then go in with transparency and show that our medicines are really valuable and people really want them, and patients need to live, long lives. They have the right to live as long as they can.
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in on that, I mean, I joined this industry in 1988. If we were sitting on a panel in 1988, it would have all been around HIV. And I can tell you the pricing discussions around HIV medicines were as hot as they were today. And it didn't really matter whether you were talking about statins or medicines for rare diseases. I mean, we've been through a number of cycles, largely because very few things ever move the needle as much on healthcare and become as visible as drugs. And yet, throughout that whole time frame, we stay at about 10% of total healthcare costs. And what's happened is that very often we make such a difference in healthcare that it can reduce the amount of ancillary care that you need. So, you know, if you think about ulcer treatment, I mean, who really has surgery for ulcers anymore? And by the way, those drugs are all available now for pennies per day. To Jean-François' point, I was with a physician at a key academic hospital who said, you know, Yervoy, one of the new checkpoint inhibitors, costs $150,000, but the total cost to our hospital is actually $700,000 because of all the other care, and it comes down to the cost of infusions and the like. And so that's where we have to go back and say, you know, we are entering into a different paradigm here. We're actually having a lot more upfront medical care costs, but having a dramatic improvement on this. And the healthcare system will adapt over time because we just won't need other parts of that. But there is more of a funding issue short term because we're used to treating everything on a chronic basis. And so guess what? The industry is also now starting to think about different funding models. We're talking about the mortgage model of pricing as an example. Can you actually spread the cost out so that, because in the year, especially when you introduce a new medicine, you're going to have both the ancillary care as well as the pharmaceutical care and get the savings later. So there's kind of a mismatch, but you can figure that out on funding models. But I you know, most of what our companies, our funds are investing in, you know, trying to figure out what the pricing environment's going to be like in 2022 or 2025 is a pretty tough thing. And my personal experience is if you come up with a medicine that addresses a true unmet need and is better than existing therapies, you'll figure out a way to get a return on investment on that.
So all of my fellow panelists here, I think, have very eloquently been making the arguments that we need to make as an industry, as a community, and as an ecosystem for investing in and developing the next generation of great therapies in oncology and in other disease areas. The reason that we have to make these arguments and be so and make a priority to educate the public and educate political leaders about the value of our medicines is because this really is a huge issue. And really back to your question, Meg, this is something that I think about a lot, and I think all of us who are investors think about a lot, in the sense that every model that you build for what an investment might be worth in the future and the rationale that you build for making the investment assumes that you're going to be able to charge a price that reflects the value that a drug brings, assuming that it meets its target profile and really provides a benefit to patients. And that has been central to driving the capital and all the innovation that's come into this area. If it weren't for, I mean, people talk critically about the $100,000 cancer drug and the increase in pricing of cancer therapies over time. But if it weren't for the $100,000 cancer drug, we would not have had the kind of investment in the cancer area that we've seen over the past 10 plus years. So we have to make sure that we find the right balance and find a sustainable balance where the public is paying for drugs that provide real value and not paying huge prices for things that are not truly valuable, not truly differentiated. But most importantly, we have to make this case as an industry because it is a huge risk. You listen to some of the dialogue that's out there and some of the politics that take place around this issue, and it really catches fire with people. I mean, people really get upset when they go to the pharmacy and find out that they're paying thousands and thousands of dollars for a drug that they don't think should cost that much. And some of that is abusive on behalf of the industry. That that we've all talked about it, it's been in the press, the companies that raise prices on things that aren't innovative. That stuff trickles back to what we're all talking about in the sense that we all get swept up as, well, you're all pharma companies and you're all trying to charge too much money for your drugs. We've got to, as an industry, do our best to stamp out the abusive practices and focus the dialogue around the value that we're bringing, because this issue could lead to some really dire consequences for the ability of all of us to make these investments and develop these therapies if we don't head it off effectively.
Yeah, actually, if I can add to that, I think it's not only in a defensive way, but I think in a true, to truly realize why we're all in this business, I think we have to solve this problem. Some of the stats are quite staggering, right? So our average American, our fellow citizen, the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical cost. 78% of those people, I think in 2014, maybe 2015, also had health insurance when they had the medical problem that caused them to literally file for bankruptcy. It is the biggest. Our medicines are increasingly unaffordable, not because we've been raising prices, but because the cost burden that's been put onto the average American by insurance companies and other aspects, other forces at work, is very large, and people can't afford them. And I think that the reason we all came into this industry is to help patients. I think a decade ago, the real rate-limiting step was to invent a great medicine. A decade from now, it may be to have that medicine, inventing the medicine may actually be easy, having people afford it may be hard. So I think it's kind of part of our responsibility as well to do what Chris pointed out, which is come up with better financing models as an industry. If we just wait for politicians or regulators or others to impose a financing model upon us, it's an awful place to be. I think it's part of the package that companies like Genzyme early on understood very well, which is we can invent the medicine, but we also have to get it to the patients. We have to put it in ways where it can be afforded by the patients, and their cost underwritten by society. I think there are new underwriting models, the mortgage model, et cetera, that we've used in other things. I mean, you could look at HIV, hepatitis, et cetera. These are public goods. We all paid a little bit to have the big dig built. Why can't we pay a little bit? If there was a cure for cancer tomorrow, we could cure a whole bunch of cancer in Massachusetts. Why would we not, as a public group, kind of invest in that? Why wouldn't there be a mortgage model or a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac? But we have to put these ideas out there, or it will come back and haunt us. Because I think for me anyway, it's part of our mission to help people. And it's just the finances are now a bigger part of the equation. So we have to figure that chemical reaction out also. Otherwise, it'll choke the whole system.
I think we could do an entire panel about pricing, but I want to move on to some other topics. I mean, we're talking about a headwind here in terms of the pricing environment, but what one might characterize as a tailwind is the regulatory environment, especially in cancer. Jonathan, do you want to kind of talk about why it seems so positive in cancer, maybe more so than other areas, and how that drives your investment decisions?
Sure. This is I would say the third major force that's been driving all of the renaissance of investment in oncology, and we've talked about the other two. And first and foremost is the science and the quality of the opportunities coming out of laboratories. Another is what we just talked about, the ability to charge a price that reflects the value when you bring a great drug out to patients. But the third really has been the regulatory environment, and this is something that has become much more of a tailwind over the last 4 or 5 years, whereas I think most of us would have characterized it as a great headwind prior to that time. And I think of an inflection point in the regulatory environment for oncology was around the 2012 timeframe in connection with PDUFA 5 and the FDASIA legislation and the breakthrough therapies designation that came out as part of that, reflected and has helped to drive a transformation in the way that the regulatory environment is interacting with companies and thinking about the paths to get drugs to the market in cancer, much less so in other areas. And that's certainly borne out by the breakthrough designation statistics, where an enormous percentage of the drugs granted breakthrough designation have been cancer drugs. There are some areas where there have been very few. I look back at just about 5 years ago, in 2011, there was an FDA advisory committee, an ODAC panel held, where the discussion there was essentially FDA saying to the community, the oncology community, and the oncology community agreeing with FDA that accelerated approval was something that maybe we should do a lot less of in oncology. And that got a lot of attention at the time and caused many of us to worry that the regulatory headwind was going to become an even greater headwind and a deep freeze, really, because the difference between being able to use an accelerated approval pathway, being able to use a surrogate endpoint such as tumor response rate or progression-free survival versus having to do an overall survival study is enormous. It's 4 or 5 years of difference in many cases in terms of the development time, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars, and that makes the difference in many cases between an opportunity being an investment that you can make sense of and one that isn't. The remarkable thing that's happened since then is the environment has gone in exactly the opposite direction than what you might have predicted if you listened to that panel in 2011. The accelerated approval pathway is being used much more frequently in oncology. Creative approaches to development, novel clinical trial designs, novel statistical designs, all of the biomarkers and targeted patient populations, all of the development techniques that have made the ability to develop a cancer drug so much faster than it was a decade ago have been encouraged by the regulators. And that reflects a lot of things. But one major thing is, I think, a shift in the mindset and the leadership of key people at FDA. And I would note Rick Pazder in particular, Janet Woodcock. Dr. Pazder, of course, is the head of the oncology division, and Dr. Woodcock is the director of Center for Drugs at FDA, have really focused on how to identify the therapies that can make the biggest difference in patients' lives in serious areas of unmet need, and how to work with the community to develop those faster and in a responsible way at the same time. And that's made, from my point of view, a tremendous difference in the ability to invest in this area.
I want to go back really quickly to that ODAC panel you mentioned. Why were they worried about too many accelerated approvals in cancer?
Well, there were several reasons, but one was the sense that a lot of drugs were being approved where it never became known, or it was impossible to ultimately know whether the drugs were providing a real benefit. So there was a lot of concern that sponsors were not completing their confirmatory studies after they got accelerated approval, which meant you'd have drugs out on the market for years and years and years without really knowing whether there's a clinical benefit associated with them. You know, a lot of this had to do with Avastin and breast cancer, where FDA found that to be an incredibly traumatic experience to try and pull an indication for a drug when the confirmatory trial did not prove out the basis for the accelerated approval. So there was a lot of concern that drugs were being approved with, say, a 15 or a 20% response rate using the accelerated approval pathway, the response rate in a refractory population, and questions around whether that really reflected a clinical benefit being delivered to patients, and that question never ultimately being answered. I happen to think the biggest driver that has helped FDA to get comfortable with using the accelerated approval pathway more and not less is that we have better drugs. So we're not talking about 15 or 20% response rates, we're talking about 50, 60, 70% response rates, where it helps everyone to be very comfortable making that leap of faith that there's a real clinical benefit there, even though we're just looking at a surrogate endpoint.
I was going to say, about that time, I remember meeting with the ASCO board, and they had expressed a similar view, but I think one of the factors was Iressa from AstraZeneca, which at the time came on the market and then seemed to only have a 10% efficacy rate. And there's actually that drug that started to make people think about targeted therapies, because the initial reaction, this is a lousy drug because it only works in 10% of the population. And then the question got deeper and said, well, why does it work in this 10%? And that actually started to change a lot of the paradigm. So Iressa kind of paid the price for that, but actually, fortunately, they didn't go down that path too far. I mean, the FDA went through a period after that with Vioxx and everything else where it became more conservative. But I think the fact that you've got a lot better biomarkers and you understand the targeted populations gives them also an awful lot more comfort in giving those regulatory approvals on an accelerated basis.
We're getting some specific questions from the audience I'd like to go to, and I'll just kind of throw these up to the panel. If anybody wants to answer them, jump right in. We have one that is, would you invest in a drug concept or a drug plus diagnostic concept?
Either.
Yes.
Is there a bias that anybody has toward either one?
I mean, to the extent that there is additional information that can actually guide the targeting of the drug, and you can actually develop both in parallel within an investment thesis, sure, absolutely. I think and it's probably going to become more and more frequent, but I don't think it means that we would not invest in a drug without a diagnostic.
But I don't think the same company necessarily has to come up with the drug and the diagnostic. So, and that sometimes is out there. I think one of the things that's held cancer research back actually is there hasn't been enough real collaboration, especially intercompany. I think a lot more combination therapy. We're starting to see that now with the checkpoint inhibitors. But I think if I look back at how did we solve HIV, it was actually companies contributing different molecules in cocktails of drugs. And I think the same thing will be here. Just if someone's got a diagnostic over here and a drug there, that's fine too. I don't think someone should stop developing a drug, but share that knowledge so someone else who maybe has the ability to develop the diagnostic can do so.
In some ways, that sort of leads us back into the pricing question, which I don't want to go down the road in again, but something we were talking about with Giovanni Caforio over lunch was the idea of, in these combination therapies, because of the pricing environment, the incentive for companies to own everything in this space and then be able to sort of more creatively think about pricing. Do you run into that same thing with a companion diagnostic, wanting to own it in order to figure out the pricing?
Look, Gilead came up with a combination between Sestiva from Bristol Myers Squibb and two of their drugs and was able to price that. I think, yeah, I mean, if you own it, you can certainly control the pricing, but I don't think that that's the only way to do it.
Another question we're getting is about epigenetics. What's your investment strategy when it comes to epigenetics? Does anybody have one?
There was a panel on that before.
Yes.
I hope they answer the question.
Well, somebody cites it as an exciting panel this afternoon, so they want to know more.
So actually, it's a very interesting angle for immuno-oncology. It turns out, and it's not only true of epigenetics drugs. So probably the first class of epigenetic drugs that people started to consider in oncology a few years back were HDAC inhibitors. And the mechanism was poorly understood initially, and then there was several putative mechanisms that were put forth. It turns out that there is rising evidence that one of the mechanisms for the activity of HDAC antagonists in oncology is actually an immuno-oncology mechanism, where it turns out that some of the HDAC inhibitor, depending on the class you inhibit, are actually changing the pattern of expression of MHC receptor, which essentially change the response, the host response to the tumor. So we're very interested in that. I should not share that with my colleague here, but I'm sure they all know that. And so we're looking very closely. Even more interestingly, beyond epigenetics, if you look at some of the very old drugs, some of the old chemotherapeutic agents, a lot of those drugs, in fact, most of those drugs were DNA damaging agent. It turns out that DNA damage is one of the mechanisms that the immune system is using to essentially facilitate the detection of tumors. And through the innate immunity and the pattern recognition receptor, when you have damaged DNA in the cell, you can actually activate some of the immune cells. So it is very likely that some of the response we were seeing 30, 40 years ago were due to mechanisms that we poorly understood that are now much better understood. So, it's interesting because you go back, it's back to the future in some way. So we are interested in trying to better understand the mechanism of some of those older agents and see if we can totally change the understanding of the mode of action.
How does that work with investing in IP in an older agent? Does that present problems or?
Well, presumably you would actually try to find new chemical entities that are actually better leveraging that mechanism.
You can also get use patents for repurposed drugs, so you can get new IP on it.
And when looking for an exit for an older drug, do you ever encounter biases from pharmaceutical companies, maybe to an older approach that maybe isn't as hot?
Sure. I mean, I don't think people in general are as interested in an older drug than a new drug, but to the extent that it's really the knowledge that is associated with the drug. If you bring a totally new understanding to an old drug with a mechanism that now can be fully leveraged, potentially in combination with other immuno-oncology agents, I think a lot of people would be interested. It all depends on the data. If you have the right data, people will be interested. If not, they won't.
But there are exceptions. I mean, you look at thalidomide, you look at AZT. The one benefit, and I think where we might be interested in investing, is if you've got a drug that's already been in man, and you've got clinical evidence, you might have a little better understanding of the safety of it. So maybe not as sexy, and it probably is not going to be the mainstream, but there are probably individual opportunities for those drugs.
I want to warn everybody we're down to 1 minute and 45 seconds, so if you have a burning question, get it in now. I want to ask about something that I think both JF and Amir touched on in their first or second comments about what's exciting. Did you guys both mention gene editing and CRISPR? And I'm just curious to know what role you see that playing in cancer drug development and what you're working on and investing in.
So actually, both firms are invested in 2 different CRISPR companies. We're not going to comment further on which one is better. I think they're both good. We have a big strategic partnership with Novartis, and it is very likely that the first application of CRISPR or gene editing in oncology will probably be in CAR T-cell, and it was actually mentioned in the previous panel. I think there is no doubt that CRISPR is a very powerful technology to engineer the CAR T-cells or other type of cell. It might work just as well with TCR. And you can essentially edit out several genes that you want to eliminate or edit and essentially create better CAR T cells. So, initially I think it's going to be around very simple deletion. And then over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see true editing where we're going to actually potentially change some of the gene in those cells.
We've also, in a different direction, but I agree with Jean-François' comment. I think there are applications, that we'll find in many different avenues. One, we have a company we've started as a private company where gene editing tools are being used to essentially do, functional biology, target validation, target prioritization, identification, and the ability to very quickly essentially take apart all the pathways in the networks and really get to the question of what do you want to hit in that particular cell, what are the key targets, is profound. It's shockingly fast and powerful tool. If you think about like RNA interference, sure, RNAi as a therapeutic modality is very promising and it's moving along nicely. That takes a lot longer than what RNAi was initially used for, which was a lot of functional biology knowledge, et cetera. And then other tools became the therapeutic. So there's a lot of use for gene editing in that arena as well. And that company and others that are like it seem to be doing very well.
Well, we're just about out of time. Any final comments from the panel? Well, that was fascinating. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you, guys.